Have you ever spent your entire youth navigating the jagged, life-and-death geometry of a battlefield, bleeding for a flag, and surviving the kind of visceral chaos that permanently rewires your nervous system, only to finally find a pocket of heaven on earth and realize that some people won't be happy until they've paved over your soul and charge you a monthly maintenance fee for the privilege of standing on your own dirt? I am a veteran, and after a decade of seeing the darkest, most fractured parts of the human condition across 3 different continents, I didn't want much for my second act. I just wanted 15 acres of jagged Colorado horizon, the sharp, intoxicating smell of pine needles on a sub-zero morning, and the rhythmic, healing sound of Crystal Creek cutting its ancient path through the heart of Aspen Ridge. This land was more than just a real estate transaction. It was a sacred inheritance, a final gift from my grandfather that felt less like a property deed and more like a sanctuary for a man who had forgotten what silence felt like. I came here to trade my service rifle for a ranch, to replace the smell of cordite with the scent of hay, and to spend my remaining years raising horses in the kind of profound solitude you can only find when you're miles away from the near siren or the frantic hum of a city that never sleeps. But on the 3rd day of my happily ever after, that silence was shattered with surgical precision by the high-pitched, entitled whine of a pristine white BMW X7 tearing up my private gravel driveway, like it was the rightful owner of every dust mote it kicked into the air, and out stepped a woman who looked like she had been carbon copied from a high-budget nightmare of suburban entitlement. Her name was Victoria Sterling, the self-appointed president of the Highland Estates Homeowners Association, and she was a walking, talking contradiction of neon pink Jim, wear oversized designer sunglasses that likely cost more than my first pickup truck, and enough clinking gold jewelry to interfere with a local radar sweep. She didn't bother to knock or wait for an invitation. She just stood there on my porch, peering at my 15-acre ranch through those dark lenses as if it were a glitch in the system that needed to be corrected by a software update, her voice dripping with the kind of rehearsed, condescending sweetness that makes your skin crawl as she informed me, not asked, but informed, that I was already out of compliance with the community standards of the neighboring Highland Estates. I tried to remain the diplomat. I tried to keep my voice at a level, military calm as I explained that my ranch was an independent parcel, an island of freedom that had existed as a working farm long before her gated community was even a blueprint in a developer's briefcase. But she just adjusted her glasses and gave me a look that suggested she didn't believe in any map she hadn't personally drawn with a highlighter, whispering a veiled, chilling threat about how everyone in Aspen Ridge eventually learns to play by the rules before sliding back into her leather-scented cockpit and disappearing in a cloud of my own gravel. The war didn't start with a bang or a shot across the bow. It started with the rustle of paper, a thick, clinical, laminated envelope containing a list of violations that read like a comedy script written by a bureaucrat with a grudge. My rustic cedar fence, hand-hewn and weathered by time, was suddenly the wrong shade of brown. My shipping container, which held the very tools I needed to restore this land, was labeled a visual pollutant, and my neatly stacked piles of building materials were cited as unauthorized debris. They hit me with a $100 a day fine, a financial parasite designed to bleed me dry before I'd even had the chance to unpack my boots. But when I sat down that night with my lawyer and pulled the original, yellowed deeds from the county archives, the truth was as clear and cold as the mountain air. My ranch was not part of the HOA. It had never been legally annexed, and Victoria Sterling was essentially attempting to invade a sovereign nation using nothing but a clipboard and a scowl. I realized in that moment that she knew exactly what she was doing. She was betting on the fact that a lone man, a broken soldier in her eyes, wouldn't have the stomach or the bank account for a long, grinding war of attrition. And that was her first, and perhaps most fatal, miscalculation. The pressure didn't just escalate. It became a full-scale psychological siege as Victoria returned exactly 1 week later, not alone this time, but with a compliance committee of 3 other residents who stood on the very edge of my property line like they were bracing for a hurricane, while she pointed at my barn and loudly proclaimed to the wind that my land was a planned expansion zone that was single-handedly dragging down the property values of their multi-million-dollar glass and steel boxes on the hill. That was the afternoon I met Silas, a third-generation cattleman from the valley whose skin looked like weathered leather and whose eyes held the wisdom of 70 Colorado winters. He pulled me aside behind my equipment shed and told me the ugly, subterranean truth that no one in the Highland Estates board meetings dared to whisper. This wasn't about the color of my fence or the aesthetic harmony of the block. The Sterling family, through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts, was the primary backer of a massive $200 million development project called the Azure Peaks Luxury Resort, a sprawling complex of world-class golf courses, high-end spas, and man-made lagoons that needed one specific, finite resource to survive in the arid climate of the high Rockies: water. And my ranch, with the pristine year-round flow of Crystal Creek cutting through its center, was the literal gold mine they needed to seize, using the HOA as a legal battering ram to harass me, devalue my land through constant litigation, and eventually force me into a fire sale where they could acquire the water rights for pennies on the dollar. I decided that night to stop playing defense and started drawing my own tactical lines, erecting a massive custom-built steel sign at the very mouth of my driveway that read in bold, reflective letters, "Private property, not subject to HOA. All trespassers will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." And the next time Victoria showed up with a yellow notice and a smirk, I met her at the gate with a body cam strapped to my chest and a certified copy of my land survey, watching as the mask of community concern slipped for a split second to reveal the cold, calculating eyes of a corporate predator who had just been told no for the first time in her pampered life. She didn't retreat. She went for the jugular, using her deep-seated connections at the Summit County Planning Office to trigger a flurry of illegal construction complaints and zoning irregularities that forced a mandatory city-ordered stop work order on my barn, the heart of my ranch, a bureaucratic chokehold designed to drain my savings and break my spirit while my expensive materials sat rotting in the seasonal rain. But then, the conflict crossed a dark, irreversible line that transformed this from a property dispute into a criminal manhunt. My hidden trail cameras, camouflaged and positioned to monitor the health of the creek's ecosystem, captured footage in the dead of night that made my blood turn to ice. Victoria Sterling herself, accompanied by two men in reflective vests, later identified as senior engineers for the Azure Peaks Development Group, dumping heavy blue barrels of industrial-grade construction runoff and toxic chemical waste directly into the upstream flow of Crystal Creek. They weren't just trying to take my land anymore. They were trying to poison the very heart of it, aiming to trigger a federal Environmental Protection Agency violation that would allow the state to condemn the entire property as a hazardous site, thereby allowing the Sterling family to swoop in and remediate the land. And as I sat in the blue light of my monitor, watching her laugh while my creek turned to sickly, chemical gray under the moonlight, I realized that I didn't need a lawyer anymore. I needed a sheriff and a cage. The end didn't come with a whimper or a polite settlement. It came with a mechanical, undeniable roar as Sheriff Miller, a man who had spent 30 years in the high country and had zero patience for suburban royalty or environmental terrorists, personally reviewed the 4K night vision footage of the illegal dumping and the trespassing, confirming through facial recognition that the men with Victoria were indeed on the senior payroll of the Sterling family's resort project. In a desperate, frantic bid to save her crumbling house of cards, Victoria attempted one final, brazen lie, producing a historical annexation agreement from the early 1970s, a forged document that supposedly showed my ranch was absorbed into the community's legal boundaries decades ago. But my legal team, now fueled by the evidence of her crimes, tore it apart in seconds, pointing out to the court that the font used in the document, Calibri, didn't even exist until the mid-2000s, the notary's stamp belonged to a woman who had been dead for 10 years at the time of the supposed signing, and the town council seal was a pixelated, low-resolution scan that any intern could have faked in an afternoon. The climax of the year reached a boiling point at the Aspen Ridge annual town hall meeting, a standing-room-only event where Victoria stood at the podium in a new, sharp suit, still trying to play the victim and frame me as a dangerous, unstable outsider. even going as far as to pull out her phone and call 911 in front of the entire assembly to report a trespasser with a weapon, referring to me, standing silently at the back of the room with a folder of evidence, only to have the sheriff himself step onto the stage, take the microphone from her shaking hand, and inform her in a voice that rumbled like thunder that filing a false police report was now the least of her criminal concerns. The final, crushing blow came from the one place Victoria never expected, the inside. Lydia, the long-suffering, overlooked secretary of the HOA who had been losing files for years just to survive the toxic environment, walked to the front of the hall and handed over an encrypted thumb drive containing 5 years of internal emails and bank ledgers, showing in agonizing detail how Victoria had been embezzling HOA fees from her own neighbors to fund the initial permits and lobbying for the Azure Peaks Resort, promising her board members lucrative consultation positions in a project that was built entirely on the theft of my water and the destruction of my land. I watched the color drain from her face as her own husband, Marcus Sterling, a man who had clearly been kept in the dark about the depth of his wife's sociopathy, stood up in the front row, looked at the projection of his own company's illegal emails on the wall, and slowly walked out of the building without looking back, leaving his wife to face the handcuffs and the flashing cameras of the local news alone as the room erupted into a symphony of righteous fury. Today, the ranch is finally finished, the barn is standing tall, and the horses are grazing by a creek that runs pure, clear, and cold once again, and the Highland Estates HOA has been completely restructured into a simple neighborhood watch that values privacy and actual community over shades of brown or uniformity. Victoria Sterling lost her home, her husband, and her freedom, eventually being sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary for fraud, embezzlement, and environmental sabotage. And there is a poetic, crystalline irony in the fact that she now lives in a facility where every second of her day is governed by the most restrictive, uncompromising rules imaginable. She tried to redraw my boundaries. She tried to claim my life and my water as her own personal trophy. But in the end, she realized the hardest lesson of the frontier. When you try to dam a river that was born to be free, the only thing that ends up getting washed away is you. When someone tries to steal your peace and calls it the common good, do you wait for the system to eventually find its conscience? Or do you build a fence high enough to keep the wolves out until the sun comes up? Was this a story of a veteran simply protecting his dirt? Or was it a final, undeniable reminder that some things in this world, like the flow of a creek, the heritage of a family, and a man's hard-won dignity, were never, ever meant to be owned by a committee? LULU stories, where the truth flows downstream, and justice always finds its level.